Welcome to Pending Final, the podcast covering all the things you never knew about VFX. So what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 9 of Pending Final, and today we are going to talk about simulations and break down kind of the different steps and disciplines within simulations. And joining me today is my lovely co-host, Helen. How are you today?
I'm good. I've had a relaxing day. I'm about to continue having a relaxing day. It's all good today. Everything's great. How about you?
All right. I'm just staying inside, staying out of this awful weather. It's very rainy and windy and just it's a very dreary day. So good day to record a podcast.
Oh yeah.
So simulations. What can we tell the common public? What is simulations within VFX?
So simulations are weirdly similar, but obviously very different to animation, in that it's the moving things that you see on the screen, but rather than being like keyframe animated, like very specifically, this leg goes here, it uses a lot more sort of physics-based simulations. So it's things that are trying to replicate things that would happen in the real world. So you've got water and fire, things being destroyed, hair and cloth simulations. So things that technically you could animate if you had a really long time, but the simulations really do sort of, I don't want to call them a shortcut because they're definitely not. They're obviously really complex things, but it's just a different way of producing these effects that really bed things into the world that they're being shown to be in.
And would you say that these are kind of done like by using like algorithms, or like, because I know you said use the word shortcut, but like, is there a way? I mean, in my very limited experience, I know you could kind of, by the shape, the size of a ball, and by putting it in an environment with this kind of gravity, it affects that. Is that kind of how these things happen, so they can get photoreal looking things like water and fire and things like that?
Yeah, so they are using a heck of a lot of maths. So they are working with different forces that exist in the real world, as well as a whole bunch of additional ones that get put in there to, spice things up a bit. But yeah, so like gravity and friction, air resistance, water resistance, all these sort of basic physical forces that exist in the real world. It's representing them in a digital environment, and having them interact with each other to interact with the materials that are there. So for perhaps you might have a model of a man standing in the sea, and the simulation would be how the water reacts around him. Like, is it going to crash into him? Is it going to flow around him? Like, how exactly is that going to work? Is the water moving back and forth? Are these big, huge waves, or is it a very gentle, still sort of pond where you can see every little movement? So it's some really intensive and technical stuff, and often it's things that you don't realize you're seeing. There's an awful lot of FX simulations for things like dust and mist, things like that are toned down very much in the final shots that you would see. But if you took them out, you would definitely feel like the world was very dead. So they really sort of, they can be anything from a really big front and center, there's a big building that's exploding, or it could be, very subtle, sort of low-level mist or clouds or things like that.
And within, I know like one of our first episodes, we talked about pipeline and things, so maybe kind of bouncing back to that. Where does this kind of fall within that pipeline of like a shot being created? Does it work in tandem with something, or where does this kind of fall within like the VFX pipeline?
So this is obviously it happens all before the lighting part. So when we start placing lights into a scene and actually rendering out these final images, but often they are interacting with the animation teams who are working on this stuff. For example, that man standing in the ocean, if we wanted him to be walking along through this water, we would need that animation of the man walking so that the simulation knows where that guy's going to be. If we start doing that simulation before we have the animation, then we don't know, we're not going to have things hitting in the right place, the water isn't going to be flowing, there's going to be sort of overlaps. So it's sort of after animation, before lighting, I would say.
That makes sense, because I know sometimes I've been in some dailies for various shows where all of a sudden they have to go back to the anim stage, and now I understand why. Sometimes it's a big deal to go back, especially if some simulations, tech anim, whatever you want to call it, has been done, that it's like, okay, now we have to kind of start back at one kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So simulation can be done by a whole host of different people, but almost always right now, Houdini will be included at some point. So that's a tool which is developed by SideFX, and they it's just a huge, very powerful simulation tool which an awful lot of the big VFX houses use. There's actually a really cool reel from Houdini's customers, which is put together by SideFX, which would be awesome if we could link that to. But you can see that it's everything from big budget movies by DNEG NPC Framestore to Pixar to live action movies of anime in Japan. So there's a whole host of different stuff being done with it. And quite frequently, these can be broken down into three sort of teams. You would have the sort of traditional FX, which is things like fire, smoke, water, destruction, that sort of stuff. Then you would have your creature FX, which are skin, hair, fur, cloth, all the things that would interact with a moving creature. And there's also crowd effects, which often kind of gets overlooked, but is such a huge part of it. It's one of the things that probably has the most academic papers written about it. There's an awful lot of papers written about crowd simulations of flocks of birds or sort of crowds of people, like how traffic runs, all that sort of stuff. That's often done using crowd simulations. And there's an awful lot of games out there as well that use crowd simulations just as sort of almost the whole point of the game. Just the other day, there was an announcement at the Sony PlayStation sort of state of play, I think they call it, for a new game that's coming out, which looks to me to just be crowd sims that you direct at each other. And I just sort of saw it and I was just, it's the sort of bread and butter of our crowd teams. So it's some really cool stuff there. And obviously everyone's interacting with the layout and animation teams in different ways. Crowd quite often can't do their simulations without an animation to begin with of, say, a walk or run cycle that gets repeated.
And we've mentioned this before. We actually mentioned this in our anim episode 2 episodes ago, where sometimes what they call like a hero character, but then you can also a hero character is that's your front and center, aka why it's called a hero. But then you can also have more of a basic kind of, you can have more of the basic, like, okay, here is, engineer 1, 2, 3, and 4, or A, B, C, and D, and they're more simple kind of like textures and things like that. But then you're able to then put them in this simulation and be able to then populate a crowd from this.
Exactly. And we can also be applying motion capture to them. So it isn't always a hand-animated walk cycle or run cycle. Quite frequently, it's a walk cycle or run cycle done by a mocap team. So obviously, it's not always going to be the same thing because we've got a whole host of different body types and physiques and levels of athleticism that mean that run cycles and walk cycles can be very different depending on the character. But it's also a really good way of getting them material to work with.
And to populate it quickly, again, by using motion capture and things. It's not cheating. It's just sometimes these films have to have like a 6-month turnaround. You need these little shortcuts or, little just tricks almost to get these things done faster, but still look great.
Yeah, it's all to do with the technology.
It's funny when you were mentioning the simulations and things, and video games and things. The first one that came to my mind was the video game Lemmings.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the
that's been
same thing.
around
This
for
thing from
years.
PlayStation is exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what the game The Sims is, or, you know, Sim Ant. I remember there was Sim Ant, and it literally was,
And SimCity.
yeah, it literally stands for simulations, and that's why they're called The Sims, or Sim Ant, or Sim City. It's simulation, and it just took me years to realize that, but I was like, oh, it's because it's a simulation. Got it.
Yeah, exactly. The name of the game that was at the PlayStation reveal was called Humanity. And it's very much a sort of, it's just like some crazy simulations going on. It was, to be honest, a fascinating trailer to watch, because I'm very interested to see if that is some real-time simulations that are happening, or whether these were just beautiful images put together for a trailer.
We'll link that in the description.
Yes, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Let you guys decide.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other things that gets done in simulation is things like cloth. So our animation teams can animate a person, sort of, you know, say a lecturer standing in front of a class gesturing with his hands, and he's wearing a jacket that's, a loose-fitting jacket. If you wanted to, animation could very easily include all that secondary motion of, once the lecturer has gestured with his arm, the fabric has that secondary motion of, it doesn't follow it exactly, it has that little bit of lag behind because of inertia. So there's that little bit of fabric that gets that needs that little bit of extra animation on it. And we could obviously have our animators put in all that secondary motion by hand every time. But what we can do is we can use simulation tools to actually do that for us. And one of the cool things that actually has been used recently is a tool called Marvelous Designer, which is almost exactly cutting out patterns the way that you would in real life for making costumes, fitting those together with the seams exactly where they would be, and that allows the simulation to be even more accurate, because it allows the wherever those seams are, there are those pinch points, so things can't move quite as far. It allows for the fabric to drape in the right places, and it's some really fascinating stuff that they've been able to just take something that's it's almost obvious when you look at how they do it. Like, of course you would just make the same patterns. Why wouldn't you do that? And obviously when you have these custom-made costumes for actors, why not take those patterns that have been made for those costumes and put them straight into the computer? So there's some really exciting stuff that happens with that. And things like Marvelous Designer, the only one that's just at the forefront of my head right now because I've been thinking about it a lot recently. But things like that can really make things feel like they are real in that world. And it's super interesting to see them demonstrated.
Sweet.
One of the other cool things is destruction.
I love the destruction. This was always my favorite dailies. One of my first couple of years in working in visual effects, I was on the FX floor, and I love seeing the FX dailies of like destruction and things. So this is always fun.
Yeah, and I actually brought this up very slightly in our 3D model episode last episode, which is, if you are planning on having a vehicle of a car that is going to be destroyed, say the bonnet's going to be ripped off and then the engine's going to fall apart and the whole thing's just going to collapse into pieces on the road, all of those individual pieces need to be made. But you wouldn't expect the animation team to individually move every bouncing nut and bolt that would fall apart. So what we do is we have our FX teams can simulate these pieces falling together. So there's a couple of different, two things that I want to sort of talk about here. One is the actual objects themselves being simulated. So where there are hard angles or curves that make, as soon as they impact the road, they would bounce in a particular way. If two of them hit each other, those two surfaces would interact in a different way to move off each other. But there's also, say, the particle effects, which aren't physical objects necessarily, but they obviously, you would have sparks flying or little tiny pieces of shrapnel that can be simulated as well that would fly off too. So this is a really cool way of making this engine falling out of a car and like being decimated into many pieces. It increases the realness of the whole thing. Like I say, every little bit of FX simulation that goes in there helps to bed it into the world and make you feel like this is a thing that's actually happening.
Yeah, and I think in today's world of like YouTube and being able to do things frame by frame, it's almost a little bit of a pressure to get it just as real world as possible, because you know somebody is going to pick up on it and go, oh, that didn't quite, that went through the floor, or that didn't bounce like how it would, or, you know, something has slipped and whatnot. Yeah. And it's funny, you talking about this made me think of one that those films that seem to have this on steroids was the Transformer films. Like literally, no, it just occurred to me. I was like, those guys at ILM just must have really, because sometimes those transformations, there almost was so much going on, you couldn't see what was going on because you would have so many spinning parts and moving and sparks and smoke and things. I mean, literally, that's what was popping in my head when you were talking about this, was just like, those teams must have just been like, yeah, I would love to see a breakdown of just all that, just an FX breakdown of doom, 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 how they did that, because that's insane. But anyway, continue.
So something that is, I think, still holds up as a really, really excellent FX reel is actually 2012, which is not a recent film, strangely enough, with a name like 2012. So this has got some really cool moments in it where it's almost simulations on simulations on simulations. So we have the animation of the ground splitting apart, with the houses all falling into the cracks and the trees all falling in, and then there's water and there's all sorts of stuff going on. So this is actually a really cool way of seeing how they layer up on each other, and how you need to have those houses falling in so that you know where those trees will have to land on top of them. It's obviously, there was an awful lot of back and forth that would have had to happen here in order to make that really sort of bed in together. Because as I feel like maybe now we might have sort of hit the point where we can just put it all in and do it all at the same time, but sometimes you need to go back and forth. There's an awful lot of different teams there, different skill sets that need to be utilized for this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. One of the other ways that sort of different types of simulations can interact with each other is the scene with Baloo and Mowgli in the river on The Jungle Book. A thing close to both Shannon and my hearts. But with that, you've got fur simulations and water simulations working in tandem, and you can sort of see how the fur moving affects where the water can go, and the water will affect how the fur clumps. So there's an awful lot of different little bits and pieces that go together, those moving parts that need to be slotted together in order to create these effects. One of the other cool things I just wanted to talk about very quickly is Dumbo, which came out at the beginning of this year, 2019. Yes. So with this one, the big thing for this simulation-wise are the ears. He's got these ridiculously enormous ears that have a huge amount of skin, and I guess you would also call them cloth, because they do act like big sheets of gross skin. But yeah, so like there's a really, really cool article on the SideFX website where they actually talk about how the simulations were done on this show, specifically the ears and also the straw that he is in for most of the movie, because that's obviously another thing where you don't want animation to have to individually place each bit of straw, but you do kind of in some ways need to art direct where that straw will be in order to make a pleasing image. So that's actually some really complex stuff that the teams had to do there. So if we can link to that one as well, because that's really interesting to read. But yeah, it's there's some really cool stuff in Dumbo and the Jungle Book with simulation work.
Yeah, I remember before I got into visual effects, it was about a year prior that I went to a talk, and they were talking about the scene where Harry is holding Dobby in his hands, and that actually that simulation wasn't skin, it was cloth, so you got the perfect pressure held, so that, you know, because obviously when you hold something, that the skin kind of gives and things.
Yeah,
but
it kind of warps under the pressure.
Exactly, and they were saying though, but what was interesting that it actually was a cloth simulation, not a skin simulation, and it was groundbreaking at the time. I don't remember exactly 100% why, because now being in visual effects, things don't wow me as much, I guess I'm now more privy to that knowledge, but I do remember very vividly them going on about that. So.
Yeah, it's I love this issue that we've kind of run into, both of us, where visual effects movies are kind of fine now. Like, they don't really, like, astonish us the way that they used to, which kind of makes me sad, and it also makes me the worst person to go and see movies with.
But it's funny you say that though, because when we were talking about 2012, I think some people get a bit like destruction movies out where they're just like, oh God, because the story isn't anything really spectacular, but what is spectacular is what has to go into these destruction scenes.
Yeah.
You know, like I know everyone hated Man of Steel because of all the destruction, how he basically tore all of Metropolis up. But then if you step away story-wise and go, yeah, but that all had to be built and things like that you kind of just... I run into an interesting thing sometimes, and I actually have people sometimes reach out to me now on Twitter when like something's happened visual effect wise. They're like, what does it mean? And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't mean anything narrative wise. It's someone didn't activate like a node or something. So yeah.
It might also be maybe time to move into crosstalk.
Sure.
I saw a tweet today about Gemini Man. Which was an article that someone had put up saying, you know, tomorrow's actors don't require a trailer or people to like wait on them hand and foot. Like, this is something that can be done entirely within a computer. And the retweet I saw was just like, yes, it was done without anybody's help. Like, nobody contributed to that digital human at all.
If anything, it's the complete opposite.
Yeah, you need a hell of a lot more people.
Yeah, like, and a whole bunch another company. And this is something we're going to touch in a couple episodes in the future, is the visual effect business, or like as a company. Like, there's a lot of like just preconceived notions that no, that actually is needed more and things. And it's interesting that you say that, because some of the guys at work were talking about the Irishman trailer that just came out for the Netflix film, and they had the de-aging of De Niro and things, but it's that's definitely the opposite. Like, no.
Yeah,
and unfortunately now, because of like Captain Marvel and, you know, this film and things like that, there's got to be like you know, I mean, it got started with Arnie from Terminator Genesis, but it's really just blown up now, kind of this de-aging and digi-double stuff actually it's more work is involved. It's not that simple.
Yeah, it's just so funny I saw that tweet and I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe someone actually wrote this article.
And it's tricky because like I don't want to come off like an arrogant know-it-all, because they just don't know. Do you know what I mean? But it's very tricky, because sometimes, and that's why, like, when we were talking about like in our animation episode and everything, that it's like I hate when people go, oh, I fixed it. I'm like, no, there is no fixing. Like, stop it. Like, it's just, yeah, I don't know. I know there's like a YouTube channel out there too where it's like VFX artists watch good CG and bad CG, or like do all these various things, and sometimes I'm hesitant because like it also bugs me like when I see things like, oh, stuntmen watching this stunt from, or not even stunt, like fight, professional martial arts or what, and I'm like, it's two different things. Like you can't even like try to bring a quote professional opinion to it when it's I digress. I'm going off topic, but yeah. As you can tell, it's a trigger thing for me. I'm just like, oh.
So trailer-wise this week, we've also had a new Frozen 2 trailer, which I am way more excited about than I was anticipating.
Me too. Me too, actually. I remember that song being played to death, and I just being at like frame store being like, oh my god, just turn it off. But yeah, I'm actually really surprised.
Yeah, it's I mean, like, aesthetically, it's, I don't know, it's the same as all the other Disney movies. Like, it looks like Tangled, it looks like Bolt, it looks like every other Disney animation that's come out recently. It's just that things are steadily getting better technology-wise. I think, like, they've always going to have that same aesthetic forever.
Yeah.
Of, the big eyes, the exact same round face. Every character's got the same face, unless they're a male, in which case they get a really interesting facial features.
Yeah, I guess that's what makes it the quote Disney look. But I think what makes this interesting, actually, and kind of tying into this episode, from what I'm getting from the Frozen trailers, I'm not as deep dived in it as maybe some of our listeners or viewers, but it seems like there's lots of elements in play. And what are the elements? Earth, wind, fire, air. Did I miss one? I don't know.
Well, wind and air are the same thing.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Well, the thing is, like, you'd say water normally, but, like, Elsa's got ice powers, so it's, like, tangentially water powers.
But that trailer, you have this wave. Like, I remember actually watching the Pixar film Ratatouille, and the opening of it, it literally felt like, okay, this is Pixar showing off in a good way. Yeah. Here's our water simulations, because that scene, it was just like, this was way too long. We did not need to see him. Brave is another one where it was like, let's look at our hair simulation. Moana, actually, I just watched some of the behind the scenes features.
The water for that, yeah.
Well, the water and hair interactions, which I didn't even think about. And it was like, oh, wait, yeah. And she has curly hair. So, and with having someone who has a better half with curly hair, appreciating the humidity and when it gets hit. I mean, it's those things that it's not even just in visual effects that these things have to be thought of. It's also in animated features. So it's, again, how some of these disciplines cross over a narrative as well. And so, yeah, I think it'll be interesting seeing these simulations done in Frozen, because they don't have to be photoreal. So you can kind of play with the physics. It doesn't have to be like, oh, God, those leaves didn't land just like how they're supposed to. Oh, wait, air is not supposed to pick up somebody in the air and not kill them like a tornado. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think what's cool about this trailer is, like, obviously with the first movie, it was just, ice. Really, I mean, like, all the fractal stuff that they were doing, super cool. Yeah. But with this one, you've obviously got, there's a load of fire in the trailer. You've got the leaves being swept up by the wind. It's all, again, looks both simulated nicely, but also kind of art directed in some way. So that's another really, really cool feature where you sort of go, okay, like how have they done that? Is that sort of partially some animation to start it off and then filled in with simulations? Like, how are they doing that? There's some beautiful mist everywhere. I love mist in movies so much. It's just the best way to add atmosphere. But yeah, there's some really cool stuff. And like you say, that enormous wave, which actually, fun aside, waves are so hard. Because, like, and to be fair, water in general is quite hard because the scale of it can look really, really wonky if you don't have the right level of detail in there. And sometimes having too much detail makes it look too small.
Well, and I think what's also fascinating about that is that's where you have the human element, where you really need a good technical, I don't know if it's technical supervisor or director or whatever, that can look at that and go, yeah, by doing that, that's actually making our set look smaller than bigger because of the size or the detail or things like that. And that's where you need that someone who has that really keen eye to detail to get it to work. Because there are sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, if they make the ripple too big, then that makes actually the the animals
world
and everything
looks
look smaller,
Yeah.
and things like that. So, and
Well,
knowing that.
that's the thing about supervisors, right? Is that if you don't have a supervisor who necessarily understands the relationship between those details and the implied size of the simulation, you can end up getting notes that end up pushing you in the wrong direction because they think that you need to add rather than take away, or they think you need to take away rather than add because they haven't had that experience, which is just a cool little aside about different types of supervisors.
Yeah, that could be a whole nother episode. But yeah, I can't think of anything else trailer-wise. But yeah, it's interesting with like Gemini Man. It's like, of course, Will Smith. He has aged great. Where it's like it doesn't. I mean, and also I remember '90s Will Smith, so it's weird. I haven't actually seen all the trailers for Gemini Man, but it is kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the de-aging, but I don't think it's going to be anything as spectacular as, like, say, what they're trying to do with De Niro. And then it runs into also that interesting conversation of one is for Netflix, one is for cinema release. And this is something maybe we can dive in when we get back into award season and things of where does the line of visual effects fall, because from where I'm working, it's all kind of becoming the same level. There's no, oh, okay, you work in TV, you're the B team. Like, it's starting to be like, no, they want the A team for everything. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yes, it's a very interesting time, but that will be another discussion another time.
Yeah, actually, there's one other thing that's come out this week or the week before, which is Ad Astra, which is a it's fine as a movie, but it does have some really cool VFX work in it. So both sort of like spacey, cool stuff.
Isn't there like a battle on the moon or something?
Yeah, some weird stuff happens in
I
this
need to
movie.
watch it, because if you think about that, car chases are hard as it is.
Yeah.
Now, take away 1/8% gravity. There, thank you, Space Camp. I remember that. That now you have to have things happen to where if a car gets hit or whatever, it's not gonna flip like it would on Earth's gravity. It's gonna do the whole woo woo woo. You know, it's really gonna. I wish people could see me doing the hand motion right now, but
I don't know. I feel like the sound effect kind of made it.
But you know what I mean? And like, and when if people get hit, that's the other thing in space. Well, I mean, space and especially there's no gravity, but on Earth there's 1/8%, and so when you get hit, you're gonna be kind of flying back, but it's not gonna be that sharp jolt. So I cannot wait to kind of hear about the sequence and things and how they had to kind of change their thinking about it and things. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But also even just your more straightforward. There's a Man Alone in Space movies, of which I think we've had one every year for the past maybe 5 years now.
Yeah.
But in this year's A Man Alone in Space movie, we have the usual thing that we do. Shut up.
Sorry.
We have the usual sort of space-themed things where you've got rockets leaving and returning into Earth's atmosphere, where you have an awful lot of reference of what that effect looks like. So there's I'm sure there's a making of video that I've seen tweeted, but yeah, you can see how they've matched their rocket re-entry simulations to actual footage of how that looks. So like,
I think
there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff in there.
Yeah, I think they did that for First Man and everything. But yeah,
it's just it's a fine movie. I don't necessarily think it needs to be a full feature-length movie. I don't think it has enough in it to make it a full. It's probably got about maybe half an hour's worth of story in it, and the rest of it is just Brad Pitt brooding. Now, and some other really weird stuff that happens, which for the first time ever, I'm not going to talk about spoilers because I think you wanted to watch it. But yeah, some weird stuff happens.
I saw a great tweet that now all the Ocean's 11 guys have been in space now. Because we had Matt Damon with The Martian, we had George Clooney with Solaris, and now we have Brad Pitt with Ad Astra.
And even Sandra Bullock's been in space.
Oh yeah!
For Ocean's 8.
Gravity. Yeah, Gravity. And it's funny, I know what Ad Astra means. It's to the stars, because that's also in the Kansas like one of the places I used to grow up was at Astra per Aspera. To the stars through adversity, or vice versa, or something like that. So yes, there you go. Even know my Latin. Woo! Thank you, Catholic school. All right. On that lovely note, Helen, where can they find us?
They can find us on @PendingFinal on Twitter, Pending Final on Facebook. We are @PendingFinal on Instagram, and you can email us at pendingfinal@gmail.com if you want to send us any beautiful comments or suggestions.
And we're also on YouTube. We're trying to get up to about 100 followers so we can get a custom URL, but we also have a video version of this if you're more kind of the YouTube folks. But thank you very much for listening to this episode, and we will see you guys next time.
Approved. Final.